All right, so welcome back. So this is part 5 of our histology lecture. And in this part, we're going to be looking at muscle tissue. So we'll look at our 3 types of muscle tissue. We'll look at how we can classify them based on their shape, based on their appearance, and based on their location and the mechanism of how they contract, or the stimulus for them to contract. So our first type of muscle tissue is skeletal muscle. This is probably the muscle that we're most familiar with and that we oftentimes associate with the term muscle. This is the muscle that is associated with our skeleton, right? So whenever we want to move our arm, whenever we want to walk, whenever we want to extend our legs, or flex backward or flex forward or whatnot, what we're contracting is skeletal muscle. All right. So skeletal muscle is fibrous in shape, so it's kind of cylindrical, and it is formed by the fusing of smaller myoblasts. So you have these smaller cells that fuse together to make one larger cell. So what this means is that our large skeletal myocytes, these skeletal muscle cells, are multinucleated because they are made from and they arise from the fusion of multiple smaller cells during development. So you turn out, or you end up with a cell that has multiple nuclei. So when you look at this histology image here of muscle tissue, of skeletal muscle, you see that if you trace one individual muscle fiber, you see several nuclei that are associated with it pushed off to the side. So this is one key characteristic of skeletal muscle tissue. You see the nuclei pushed off to the side. You also see these stripes, or you see these striations across the running perpendicular to the muscle fiber. These are called striations, and this is a result of the contractile proteins that make up this muscle that allow it to contract in a very specific way. And we will look at the mechanism of muscle contraction when we do our muscle lecture and we look at excitation, contraction, coupling in a muscle cell. Now, skeletal muscle, as we all should be largely familiar with, is under voluntary control, meaning that we have conscious control over this muscle. We can choose to contract it. We can choose to not contract it. All right. So we find this associated with our skeleton. It's involved with motion, so movement, posture, like the muscles running along our back, our skeletal muscle. You can also produce heat. So through the process of shivering, you can produce heat by the rapid contraction of skeletal muscle, right? And then the big things, it is striated and it is voluntarily controlled, all right? It will be our only voluntarily controlled muscle tissue that we'll see, all right? So our second type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle tissue. So when you hear the term cardiac, you got to think heart, right? So this is our heart muscle, our myocardium, which is the thick muscular layer of the heart. When you talk about the heart, you'll talk about different layers to the heart, and the middle myocardial layer is what's made up of this cardiac muscle tissue. So it is branched, whereas the skeletal muscle that we just looked at is more cylindrical and fibrous, so it doesn't really have this branching appearance to it. Cardiac muscle is also striated, just like skeletal muscle was, so it contains those contractile proteins oriented to give it this striped and striated appearance, all right? You also see these small kind of dark bands that run perpendicular to the orientation of the muscle fiber. And these are called intercalated discs, okay? Intercalated discs. So you see them in this bottom right image, you can see these dark purple lines that run perpendicular to the orientation of the muscle fiber. These intercalated discs serve to join and link adjacent cardiac myocytes together. And as a part of this intercalated disc, there is something called a gap junction. And the gap junction allows ions in the electrical impulse to flow quickly from one cell to the next. And so this allows our heart to contract as one functional unit. Okay, so these cells generally have just one nucleus, but some of them may be binucleated or have more than one. But usually they're going to have one. So this is another difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. And then cardiac muscle, obviously, as we should know, is involuntarily controlled. Right? We do not have the conscious ability to make our heart contract. Right? If we had to consciously control the activity of our heart, we would all be dead. Right? We would not be able to sustain that for for life. Okay, and obviously we need our heart in order to pump and circulate blood, carrying oxygen to our various tissues. Okay, so it's branched, usually mononucleated, has those gap junctions, or has those intercalated discs with gap junctions, and then it is involuntary. All right, so you can see this here making up our heart, and you can see this branched network to the cell itself. All right, so answer this question: what is found as a part of the intercalated discs that allows ions to move quickly and freely from one cell to the next? So pause the video, try to answer this, and I will move on. So the answer in this case is going to be C, right? This is going to be the gap junctions that allow the ions and the electrical impulse to move quickly and freely from one cell to the next, okay? All right, and then our last muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue. The term smooth comes from this idea that it is not striated. So this is our only non-striated muscle tissue. And instead of saying non-striated, we just say smooth. So the name of this is smooth. It has a smooth appearance to it without the presence of those striations. All right. These are also mononucleated, like cardiac muscle fibers usually are. And they're what are called spindle shaped. So they're kind of tapered, meaning they're thicker in the middle. And then as you go out toward the end, they kind of taper down to a point. And they have one single nucleus that is elongated, usually in the middle. Okay. So they have this spindle shape. You can see it here, kind of thicker in the middle and then coming to a point on the ends. And again, this is a smooth, non-striated muscle tissue. This is also involuntarily controlled. So like cardiac muscle, we do not have the conscious control over smooth muscle contraction. Okay. So you find a smooth muscle lining hollow tubes. So you find it largely associated with the gastrointestinal system, so with the alimentary canal in the stomach, causing stomach churning and contractions, lining the small and large intestine to help with peristalsis and the movement of material in the intestines, help to move it along. You also find it lining our blood vessels, right? So to help propel and squeeze blood as it is moving along through those blood vessels. All right. So you can see it here, found in the walls of hollow organs, like we just said, stomach, intestines, parts of the GI tract, parts of the urinary tract as well, blood vessels. You may also find it in the respiratory passages to control the constriction or dilation of our bronchioles. You can also find it in the parts of the female reproductive tract, such as the uterus. Okay, it is non-striated, so it's smooth, and it is involuntarily controlled, as we said. So let's look at some images here, and then we'll stop this part and we'll move on to our last part. So look at these pictures, pause the video, try to answer these, and we'll move on. So look at this tissue here. You should recognize this as being cardiac muscle tissue for a couple of reasons, okay? One, and this is how you can approach identifying tissues. First, right off the bat, try to identify if it's striated or not, okay? If it's not striated, you already know what it is, it's smooth, because that's our only non-striated muscle tissue is smooth, right? So you look at this, I see striations, I see these lines moving or running perpendicularly. I see it on this image up here too. So we know this is either skeletal or smooth, skeletal or cardiac. So now I want to look at the nucleus. Well, when I look at the nucleus of these ones down here, I see large nuclei, and they look like they're kind of in the middle of the cell. They're not small, and they're not pushed off to the side, and there's not very many of them. So this is another characteristic that tells me this is going to be cardiac muscle tissue, okay? Now, if we look at the top, we notice these arrows. These arrows are pointing to these dark bands, and we can see them down here as well without the arrows, that run perpendicular to the orientation of the muscle fibers. What are these dark bands called, right? These dark bands that run side to side, hint, they connect adjacent cells together, hint, they contain gap junctions. So these are going to be intercalated discs, right? These are those specialized junctions that help to join adjacent cardiac cells together to allow the electrical impulse to flow freely from one cell to the next, right? So look at this muscle tissue here, try to answer it. This is smooth muscle tissue. So when I look at this, I see no striations. I don't see any distinct kind of perpendicular fibers or images running perpendicularly across these muscle fibers. I also see very elongated nuclei. You can't necessarily make out individual cells in this example. It's kind of difficult, but you can see those nuclei, and this is very characteristic of smooth muscle. You also note that they kind of form these sheets. They stack on top of each other. And so this is a good example of smooth muscle. So you may find this lining the GI tract, the uterus, lining blood vessels, something like that. Okay. And then lastly, the only one that we have not done yet is skeletal muscle, right? So we notice that these are very cylindrical. They're very fibrous in shape. So sometimes skeletal muscle is just called muscle fibers instead of muscle cells. They're just called muscle fibers. You notice many small nuclei that are pushed off to the side. So it's multinucleated, and you also note the presence of striations as well, right? So many nuclei, multinucleated, pushed off to the side, cylindrical and fibrous, it's striated. You know that this is a voluntary tissue, and so this has to be skeletal muscle tissue, all right? So we will stop there, and then we will pick up with our last part, talking about nervous tissue in our last part of our histology lecture.